In this class we want to talk about trade and some of the issues arise when we consider international trade. For a start, let's look at the reasons for trade, and one of the basic reasons for international trade is the domestic non-availability of goods. We can imagine this on various levels, on primary goods and on secondary goods. On primary goods, we may not be able to efficiently produce some items that other countries can. For example, citrus fruit, bananas or oranges or lemons or tropical fruit. Countries may be able to produce it, but it's just so expensive to do. It's far better to trade with the countries that find it easy to produce those items, and trade with them, give or exchange items that they want in return for the fruit or for the primary goods that we want. It could also be not so much primary goods, but it could be produced goods. Some countries have a talent at making certain things. Germany makes good engineering products, and America makes electronic products, and Japan make electronic products and cars and so on. So countries develop an expertise in certain areas, and it's best for us to trade to get those items. It's more efficient to do it that way. So we call this domestic non-availability. They're not generally available within a country, so we trade to get them. International trade is just the exchange of goods and services between countries. That's all international trade is. An import is the UK purchase of a good or service that's made overseas, if we're considering the UK as the country here. So an import into the UK is some item or good that's made overseas. And an export, say from the UK, is a good made in the UK and sent overseas, traded overseas. So international trade is actually a very straightforward concept. And generally speaking, nations trade because they lack raw materials or the climate, as in the case of citrus fruit I mentioned earlier, or other fruits, other tropical fruits like bananas or whatever. And sometimes countries have specialist labour or specialist technology, special talents to do certain things. And trade flows in a great variety of goods and services around the world. This improves our standard of living, the quality of our lives. Essentially, it's based on something called the principle of comparative advantage. Now, the principle of comparative advantage goes back to a very famous economist back in 1817 in the UK, an economist called David Ricardo. And the principle of comparative advantage states that a country will produce benefits by concentrating on the production of goods and services for which they have a relative advantage. It's best for countries to produce items that they are the best at making. They may be best at everything, they may be good at everything, but there's one item in which it is especially good, and it should concentrate on that item. For instance, France has a climate and an expertise to produce better wine than Brazil, but Brazil is better able to produce coffee than France. So it's best for each country to specialize in the good that most suits it. So France would create a surplus of wine, and it trades the wine with Brazil in exchange for coffee. That's the most efficient way to have trade. Now, trade is trade flows between countries based on this idea of comparative advantage. But there are problems with trade. There is, for example, something called protectionism. Countries want to protect their own industry, or they don't want to allow imports in for various reasons. And this flies in the face of specialization, and of course the consumers therefore are deprived goods cheaply, goods that could be bought overseas. Having said that, there are advantages to protectionism. At least the textbooks identify some, and we should go through these briefly here. So let's look at some of the advantages of protectionism, protecting countries against imports, stopping imports, for example. So it occurs when one country reduces the level of its imports for various reasons. For example, it could do so because it's got a new industry arising, sometimes called the sunrise industries or sunrise firms. It's producing new technology, for example computers, and it has to compete with established companies overseas, so the country tries to make it difficult for the overseas companies and countries to damage the new industry that's springing up. This is called the infant industries argument, and it's often quoted in defense of protectionism. You can see immediately a problem with this one because sometimes the infant industries never grow up. They always remain infant industries and always need protection, in which case it's flying in the face of consumer welfare. Consumers want items cheaply, they want good quality items, and if they can't get the imports, then their standard of living is adversely affected. So the infant industry argument for the protection of some industries is dubious. It could be debated. Another argument is unfair competition. Foreign firms may receive subsidies, for example, and this may lead to what's known as dumping. Dumping means selling goods abroad at a price that's lower than the price in the domestic market. So goods in one country could be sold in a different country cheaper than where they were produced. That's called dumping. It's an effort to destroy industries overseas, and later on, because the industries overseas have been destroyed, the country who dumped the items could then expand their market. It's not a fair practice, so it's known as unfair competition. The idea is to dump items overseas, destroy industries overseas, and therefore try to take over their market. Sometimes people just try to protect industries at home and protect home markets by restricting imports, simply to help the balance of payments, to reduce imports in total. But of course, if every country did that, the level of world trade would fall, and poorer countries would be very badly affected. They wouldn't be exporting, and the standard of living around the world would be affected adversely. People would not be as well off. So the problem of trying to fix a balance of payments problem by restricting imports means it could lead to retaliation overseas. Other people will do the same, other countries will do the same, and the volume of international trade in total would fall as a consequence, leading to a lower standard of living throughout the world. It's also an argument that some strategic industries have to be protected, for example defence. Relying on the imports of defence goods, some countries would consider it to be wrong. If the country needed defence, it might decide to produce it at home because the supplies are more secure than trying to buy it from abroad. So some strategic industries might be protected as well. And there's also an argument to say that protectionism is levied to protect declining industries. Some industries which are long established, old, are not as popular as they were in the past, and the demand for the product is falling off. They should be protected until new industries are set up in place, in their place. So declining industries are also candidates for protection. But again, as I said, this might lead to retaliation in other countries who would use the same argument, and thereby the total value of goods traded internationally may fall and people are poorer as a consequence. Let's look at the disadvantages of protectionism. Well, First of all, it prevents countries from enjoying the full benefits of international specialisation in trade. If we take the UK as an example, the UK could grow bananas, technically. We just build big greenhouses and heat them up and it could grow bananas. But it wouldn't be an efficient thing to do. It's far better to find countries that grow bananas naturally and trade with them. And that's how we benefit from international trade. So a disadvantage of protectionism is that it would prevent international specialisation. It also, of course, provokes other countries to retaliate. If a country imposes restrictions on imports, other countries impose restrictions on imports as well. And that means the total volume of trade in the world declines, as I said earlier. And protectionism can protect inefficient industries, domestic industries, which means consumers get inferior goods and they have to pay more for them. So the consumers are disadvantaged by protectionism. Now, the ways in which protectionism is implemented are in various ways. For a start, you could have a tariff on a good. A tariff is just a tax on the good, on the import. So a tariff is a tax on the import. We could illustrate this with diagrams, which we will in a second. But the tariff essentially is a tax on the good, so it raises the price of the import. It reduces, of course, the demand for the import as a consequence. It should encourage the demand for home-produced substitutes, if there are any. And of course, the tariff, being a tax, should raise some revenue for the government. Let's have a look at the diagrams associated with the tariff. Well, here's the supply and demand for this particular good, and there is the price of the good in the domestic market. PE is the price. Now, if the government imposes a tariff, there's the tariff, then the supply curve moves to the left. That means the new equilibrium price is P2, and the quantity demanded will have fallen to Q1. Now, the new price, the difference between PE and P2, that increase in price, that's what the consumer has to pay. That's the additional charge for the consumer. So the consumer pays part of the tariff. The increase in price, that's the increase in price resulting from the tariff. So the consumer pays more. It's P2 minus PE. The importers have to pay more as well, because previously the importer was getting PE, that was the equilibrium price, but now it's only getting P1, because the quantity demanded has remained the same, and the new price, the new equilibrium price of P2, means the consumers only get a revenue of P1. So the difference between P1 and PE is what the importers have to pay. So the total tariff is split into two parts: what the importers pay and what the consumer pays. The consumers pay the difference between P2 and PE. The price has gone up, that's what the consumers pay. The importers only receive P1. They used to receive PE, so the importers are paying the difference between PE and P1. The tariff is P2 minus P1. So P2 minus P1 is the tariff. Consumers pay P2 minus PE extra. And the producers pay PE minus P1 extra. And also, of course, the quantity demanded for the good has fallen. Imports themselves have fallen by QE minus Q1. So that difference there is the amount by which imports have fallen. So if you look at the diagram in total, the consumers pay more, the importers get less, and the quantity of imports has fallen. And that's the effect of the tariff. In addition to tariffs, we've also got quotas. The government may impose a quota on the amount of imports, and we have other protection techniques as well that you need to look at. First of all, let's look at this idea of a quota. A quota restricts the actual quantity of imports allowed into the country. So the government might impose a quota on the number of cars that's allowed to be imported, or the amount of textiles that can be imported, or whatever. So it's a restriction. It could be in terms of value, or it could be in terms of the physical quantity of the items, the number of cars, or the value of the cars. So it's a quota levied on some base like that. It raises the price of the imports, and of course it reduces the volume of the imports. But it should encourage domestically made substitutes, if there are any. So if the government restricts the number of produced cars coming into a country, and there is a domestic industry producing cars, then that industry should benefit. They should sell more domestically produced items, because the imports are restricted. They'll go up in value, they'll go up in price, I should say, and they'll be difficult to get. The other protection techniques, well, it could be the government make it difficult for imports through having very bureaucratic procedures for imports. Many forms to fill and get approval, and it may be there are charges for documentation, and it might take time to get approval to import. Administrative practices might be such. It may also have exchange controls. It might not allow importers to import because they can't get the foreign exchange. So there are two types of protection techniques. There are institutions that are arising more and more throughout the world that are attempting to deal with these. We'll have a look at a few of these now. The first of all is the European Union. Well, this was established in 1957. It's now called the European Union, and the members of this particular customs union are aiming for economic and even political unity. So it's creating one big market in which there are no restrictions on imports or exports. So there's no protectionism of any nature. It has various objectives. The free movement of capital and labour. It's got free trade as an objective between the member states. And it imposes a common external tariff. So any countries outside the European Union have one tariff to meet. Once the goods are inside the European Union, they're free to move. It also has a common agricultural policy called CAP, C-A-P, which guarantees minimum prices for farmers' output. And it's also gone on to standardise trade practices and procedures, and standardise many of the issues and practices that are conducted when importing and exporting goods. For example, having standards regarding quality, measurements, weights. So there's a process of standardization, and that's designed to make it easier in the long run for importers and exporters and people trading across distances to conduct their business. There are other institutions that should be mentioned also. The International Monetary Fund, for example, the IMF. And the IMF was established at Bretton Woods, a small place in New Hampshire, at the end of the Second World War. And the idea there was to stabilise exchange rates at the end of the Second World War, to fix the exchange rates, because fixed exchange rates would lead to greater trade, because there's less uncertainty about the exchange rate movements. So Bretton Woods Agreement set up a fixed exchange rate system at the end of the Second World War. there's now a large number of countries who are members of the IMF, and they pay a subscription, and then the countries can borrow out of this pool of money, of resource that the other countries have put in, if there's a balance of payments problem or if there's some issue with international trade. They can draw a percentage before the IMF would impose certain conditions on the loan. So the IMF is really like it's a bank. It's a bank. It has reserves that the members put in, and then countries who are in difficulty can borrow from the reserves. But after a while, the bank, like any bank, will impose conditions. In 1967, it created a new currency called a special drawing right, SDR, which is not really that popular. Most trade and most relationships, international relationships, are still conducted via the American dollar. But this was an effort of sharing around the benefits of having an international currency. It was created in 1967 as a special drawing right, but hasn't proved that successful. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is the World Bank, it lends for different projects and helps countries out of financial problems from time to time. It makes very long-term loans at low rates of interest to try and help countries. But again, it is a bank, and it can impose conditions on the loan, so that countries have to behave in a certain way and have certain monetary and fiscal policies to ensure that their long-term problems don't recur. There's also an agency called GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The idea here is to reduce all the obstacles to trade and to liberalize trade throughout the world, so it's easy to import and export, and thereby, of course, people will benefit as a consequence of the trade. We'll have the benefits of specialization and cheaper goods and a greater variety of goods because of imports and exports. The interwar years were characterized by competitive trade restrictions. Countries more and more were trying to get an advantage over each other by restricting imports and subsidizing exports, and there are all sorts of not quite proper ways of trying to trade and trying to get an advantage over each other. And to regulate that and to bring about some sort of consistency, GATT was developed. It was established in 1948 to provide a system of rules governing international trade. Now, most countries are members of GATT, and GATT is permanently and continually trying to negotiate away tariffs and obstacles to trade, so that there will be more world trade in the future, helping poorer countries and helping everybody benefit from the advantages of specialization, international specialization. So the main aims of GATT are to get rid of tariffs and restrictions. Infant industries can be protected by tariffs, but not by quotas. So some taxes are allowed. But again, GATT don't like the infant industry argument too much, so it's monitored, and after a period of time there's pressure on the governments to not use this argument. The GATT members have to be open about any domestic trade restrictions they've got. And as I said, GATT are continually trying to negotiate away obstacles to trade. There's also an organisation called the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. This one's quite straightforward. It just simply is made up of member countries who send a representative to the Council, and it offers an opportunity to discuss common policies to try and help stabilise exchange rates and encourage growth. It's it's not so much a legalistic organisation, it's more trying to encourage and nudge people towards behaving in a proper way that will bring about greater world trade. It also publishes economic surveys on countries to see how they're doing and to make recommendations about their policies, and which have got some power because it can embarrass governments if the government is not behaving correctly, or if it's imposing tariffs and trying to hide the tariffs it's imposing or whatever. OECD can expose this, and it can expose long-run problems with the economic policy of a country. Governments don't like to be exposed in this way, so OECD have power through publicity, if nothing else. There's also OPEC and many other organisations. OPEC is just one picked almost randomly to say, look, there are lots of other organisations. OPEC is the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It controls the amount of oil produced and hence the price of oil throughout the world. So it's a very powerful organisation because, at least at the moment, everyone is so dependent on the price of oil. And the producing states, the oil producing states, form themselves into OPEC to govern the price and the production of oil. But there are many other organisations in many other areas, cartels and agreements on copper, tin, all sorts of items. So international trade is a very complex area, and that's the backdrop for protection, arguments for and against, and some of the institutions that are trying to remove restrictions on international trade. So hope that was useful. Thank you for watching.